The embargo is lifted and I can now sing like an elven canary. Hello, I'm William James. Let's start this. I, through sheer coincidence and luck and a very good friend, got to see the first 2 episodes of The Rings of Power. I've been dropping hints in several of my videos, and I do love the fact that people just completely bounce over them. I find that interesting. By the way, there is a special place in hell for my knees after standing for over 2 hours watching this debacle. That's not a fun experience. Anyway, let's start the review, kind of. I'm keeping this as spoiler-free as possible, for the simple reason, plot points and details, I don't want to be that person, but I will be going into the writing, the structure and characterization. You're in for an interesting ride. The book rights for this cost $250 million alone. What did they get for that? Not much. This is a, air quotes, prequel based on the appendices of the novels, the notes dumped to the back of Return of the King, which chronicle a millennia of tangled history, and are stories that take place over that course of time. What did they actually get for that, and how did they use it? They didn't. They have rights to this material, but they've actually used very little of it, other than basic plot threads and basic character narratives. The rest of it is entirely original. And I will say this, no doubt the budget for this is pretty high. You can see it in some of the shots. There are some beautiful looking computer-generated places of beautiful cities and mountains and some generic monsters and all of this stuff. But when it looks good, it looks good. When it looks bad, it looks really bad. Some of the CGI is textureless, some of it looks very flat. And it's one of the massive disconnects in this show. The overall style of this show is completely unrelated to each other. One minute you have things that almost look like Renaissance paintings or pre-Raphaelite imagery. Next minute you have things that look like they're ripped straight from Game of Thrones. None of the characters and the scenes look like they share a universe, which is a really weird disconnect to see in this. It's almost as if there are about 3 different people doing the art style, and the inconsistencies with the art style are fascinating. There's nothing that grounds it. They've also gone for a much more high fantasy approach in terms of costume and design. The costumes, when they look good, but a lot of them look very cheap. I've picked up on this before. Printed on armour, printed on chainmail, 3D printed pieces that obviously are extremely light and weightless. The same with the swords, and a lot of the weaponry you see in this film is a weird mix of very heavy looking pieces, but most of it looks, again, 3D printed and weightless. Again, how many people are involved in this, and I'm interested on how many people and special effects artists. Was it one team? Was it several? And was it done by different people? Because I cannot see any commonality here. This is very much rooted in the high fantasy, but bears very little resemblance to the more grounded high fantasy of Tolkien's world. There's no basis in reality here. And that's where we go into other things as well. They've created something, tonal dissonance is the word, they've created something here that bears no resemblance, barring a handful of pieces, visually to Tolkien's world. And again, the overall cheapness of a lot of these costumes is just bizarre. The overall cheapness of some of the sets is also bizarre. Again, when they look good, they look really good. When they look bad, they look bad. And the problem with that is, where did most of this budget go? Again, and I've said this many times, this is the most expensive TV show ever made. It should look it. That's what I find interesting. Just a side note, to get this out the way, overall aesthetics of this show have a very artificial, very CGI look, or kind of like the Twilight movies or the Underworld movies. It's a very artificial aesthetic, and there's a lot of digital alteration going on with faces, but the problem is the aesthetic is not consistent. One minute it looks very artificial and very shiny, again, like the Underworld movies, or even Twilight, that kind of very smooth look, to very real and gritty. There is no consistency within this. Now, let's talk about the main focus of the show, Galadriel. Galadriel is a fascinating character within Tolkien's works. She's actually one of my favourite female characters. She is this strong, charismatic, powerful woman on screen, and anyone who says Tolkien doesn't do female representation really just needs to look at Galadriel. This is not the Galadriel of the books. This is not the Galadriel of the prideful Galadriel of the Second Age. This is the angry young woman archetype that gets really old. She spends most of her time screaming at people and being told she's wrong, but then proceeds to vagina-splain everything. Her backstory bears little to no resemblance to the Galadriel of the works of the books or the Peter Jackson movies. Her backstory is more in line with Elrond of the books, which I find really strange. His story is more in line with Galadriel's of the books. I don't know how they've done that, although there's still bits left in. The actress is not doing a good job here, and she's not bringing her A game. There is no way around that. Her acting is a bit stiff and a bit wooden, and she's trying to be ethereal, and it's not working. She doesn't have the strength on screen that Cate Blanchett has, and I know that's an unfair comparison because Cate Blanchett is phenomenal. See her as Elizabeth. She doesn't bring this at all, and that's a problem. But the Galadriel problem of this is they've made her in some unlikable Mary Sue. She has very little characterization. Like I said, she's either shouting at people, or she's angry, or she's spouting badly written, nonsensical gibberish that makes no sense. She reminds me of Michael from Star Trek Discovery, or Rey from Star Wars. There's very little characterization going on here. There's very little depth to this, and it's very surface level with her portrayal. I get that she's younger here, and it's her prideful years, but like I said, there is no resemblance to Tolkien in terms of the characterization. There is no reference to that story, her actual backstory. And I do find it interesting they swapped it with Elrond. They've neutered Elrond badly. And he's very unrecognisable as Elrond of the books. Making her the brave warrior and literally interpreting the phrase Amazon literally is not the best decision they could have made. She isn't this character, and there is no semblance here, and it's kind of sad. But to make her so unlikable, so angry, so I am Michael from Star Trek, is a tragedy, because they've really wasted one of the best female characters in fantasy. The Halffoot stories. So the Halffoots in this are not hobbits in this version of the story. I find that strange. Halffoots are a type of hobbit, and I don't think they have many rights. The hobbits, air quotes, did nothing important before the Third Age. And I get that they could put a hobbit story in this, but this story is completely original. Lenny Henry, I didn't know was an actor. I always think of him as a comedian or Mr. Dawn French, to be honest, because they were married. I didn't know he was an actor, and I will say he's doing an okay job. I will give him credit where credit's due. But can I ask a question? Why do the Halffoots talk in a hybrid Jamaican and Irish accent, with a little bit of Somerset thrown in for good measure? I know they're going for the high fantasy thing, but that's a really weird mix. The Hobbit story is very comedic, it's very light, it's very fluffy. Rubber Hobbit syndrome. The Halffoots, sorry. And they're trying to be whimsical and cute, and again, the tonal dissonance. A lot of the comedy that they're doing and a lot of the more slapstick stuff is very juvenile and doesn't feel like a Hobbit role. The costumes, the style they're wearing is again not applicable to Tolkien. That's going to be a common theme of this video. There's very little of Tolkien's portrayal of hobbits. Hobbits are creatures of comfort. They aren't people that walk around in dirty clothes, dirty hair with acorn garlands. They are creatures of comfort, and it's kind of a sad state to see this. They've pulled in a lot of Polish and a lot of English and a lot of oddly Swedish and Scandinavian culture into them, where again they should be purely British. They're kind of like little farmers. Again, no semblance to Tolkien. Lenny Henry does an okay good, trying to be whimsical and cute, but it just comes across kind of random. Also, some of the lines they deliver are very not great. And I mean that. Ultimately, this show feels more like Game of Thrones. It's very slow, very plot heavy, and not multiple plot threads. The original characters I didn't want to bring up, partly because they're original characters. There's no comparison to Tolkien here. The problem is, these characters also exist to fill the gap left by the characters they didn't have rights to. They're also trying to replicate the Lord of the Rings storyline slightly, an epic journey across Middle-earth, which, in fairness, a lot of the Second Age stuff is, but they are literally ripping off those character dynamics and those moments, so we're bringing in those elements. This story cannot be read as canon to the books in any way. It's its own canon, or to the Peter Jackson movies. It's very distinct and it's very separate. Stylistically and tonally, this has more in common with Game of Thrones, including how it's plotted together and many other things. You can tell that they were going for this kind of Game of Thrones socio-political epic journey across Middle-earth. The timeline compression isn't doing this many favours, and I've mentioned that in other videos. Again, laying hints that no one picked up on. Maybe when people see it and they watch those videos back, they will. The timeline compression isn't doing this any favours. There's no depth to this story. It reminds me very much of the Shannara Chronicles, that god-awful MTV thing they made a few years ago, based on the books by Terry Brooks, including just the characterization and tonal dissonance that it has, between light and fluffy to very dark and ultra-violent. A lot of everything feels very ethereal and very light. Weaponry, weight, costumes. A lot of it is literally drawn from their heads, and you can definitely tell when there is a lot of green screen. Some of the sets were not sets, they're just standing there on green screen once upon a time style. The issue here is that this is trying to be everything and nothing at once. This show doesn't know who it's for. This show doesn't have any audience in that sense. It doesn't know if it's for hardcore fans, it doesn't know if it's for the casual fans, and it doesn't know if it's just for the general public. It also doesn't know if it wants to be an adult or a children's show. Again, tonal dissidence. The characters, everything is built up, and like I said, it's such a mixed bag. When it looks good, it looks good. When it looks bad, it looks bad. There is this very weird, cheap vibe to it, and a Greco-Roman aesthetic as well, which I can see working, but given the fact that this story and these characters, and the original characters, are literally archetypes ripped from other Tolkien material, by the way. They've literally borrowed elements from other characters that are real in the books to put onto these original characters, because again they exist purely to replace who they don't have the rights to. This show does absolutely nothing new. It doesn't know who it's for, and it's several hours of my life, including travel, I will never get back. I even have a Rings of Power Kit Kat box here, which is ridiculous. I might put that on eBay. This show doesn't know who it's for. It doesn't know what it wants to be. It doesn't know how to be a Tolkien show, and it doesn't even do Game of Thrones well. Like I said, it bears more in common with the Chronicles of Shannara than anything else. or the Shannara Chronicles, depending on which side of the Atlantic you're on and what channel you're watching it on. Overall, this is a very expensive catastrophe, and it's interesting seeing people's reaction now that we can talk about it. And I'm going to lay a hint in, because I can't go, again, specific plot points I cannot go too far into. I might get sued if I do, to be honest. There are references to Tolkien's work, but they are purely references. It's like watching a horror movie and they do a nod to Alfred Hitchcock. I'll put it that way. I didn't recognise this story. I didn't recognise these characters as Tolkien. I didn't recognise what they were trying to do. And if it was an original fantasy series, I would probably be a lot kinder. But there is better shows out there. The House of Dragons is a better show than this. Episode 3 of The Rings of Power aired. I watched it, not on Amazon, so you don't have to. Let's talk about the mess, shall we? First things first, this episode seems to be worse than the first two. Characterization is all over the place. The pacing is extraordinarily bad, to the point that when it slows down to a snail's pace, literally the life support machine is keeping it going. Characters are badly written, and there's a lot of uncomfortable and weird moments with these characters as well. The dialogue is as cringy and as poorly written as ever, and actually downright cheesy. It's not even bad, it's just cheesy, and not in an endearing, fun, nice way. It's cheesy in a I'm slightly embarrassed to be watching this way. Episode 3 follows Galadriel on her journey as always, and trying to replicate the Fellowship of the Ring. And another character finds himself captive. Galadriel and another character explore a legendary kingdom, and another character is given a new assignment, and another character face consequences. This is so choppy. Like, multiple POVs are great in a story. They are. Game of Thrones does it very well. But there's always breathing room. There's no breathing room in this. Stuff just happens, and it gets frustrating. There were times when I was watching this and I downright burst out laughing. Galadriel, OP person of the year who can somehow jump off a boat and swim the Atlantic Ocean, comes across cold and indifferent throughout this, or just angry. The angry woman trope in fiction is getting really old. I talked about that in another video and got called an incel. That's fun. And I do love the fact that Amazon right now are trying to save this sinking ship. The desperation that I'm feeling from them is hilarious. Everything is being weaponized. If you do not like our show, you are an ist of some kind. And it's kind of pathetic. I don't know how they've got to this point, and I don't know where they're going with this. This episode was basically content. It was filler. There was no rhyme or reason. It barely pushed any story forward. Again, with the cheesy and poor writing that is also uncomfortable in places, that it just feels so disjointed. And the characterization of everyone is reasonably inconsistent, to the point that I do wonder if it's even written by the same people. My same criticisms still stand of the first two episodes. The CGI is very hit and miss. When it looks good, it looks good. When it looks bad, oh mother of God, it looks like a PS1 game. You know, the FMV sequences. The costumes still look cheap. There is no saving those costumes at this point. And why, just side note to previous episodes, why is there dwarven stuff on elven costumes? Just a thing. And why is it swapped around? But anyway. Oh, and gold laurels. I don't get it. What's with the Roman thing? I don't know how they've got to this point, and I've, again, the same criticism, that I don't recognise this story. I don't recognise these characters from Tolkien's work. I don't recognise the characterisation, let alone the story, and that's where it kind of is falling apart. The fact that House of Dragons is beating this really does say everything, doesn't it? The House of the Dragon is a phenomenal show, and I talked about that in another video, several videos actually. But this series is really just falling flat on its face, to the point that it's becoming a cosmic joke. I don't get how they've got to this point, and I don't know where they're going to dig themselves out of it. If this show makes season 2 with the delays and everything that's happening, I will be shocked. But the quality of this show is not here. If you want cheesy, fun fantasy, watch Xena. Xena Warrior Princess has better dialogue, better characterization, better looking costumes, and in some cases better looking fight sequences than this mess. The characters are bland and flat and one note. I mean, Galadriel has all the characterization of Michael from Star Trek, and that's not a compliment. This episode is embarrassing, and the pacing and the writing and just the whole structure of this fall apart. They're trying to tell this multi-arc story, yet they're not telling a multi-VOP story. They are telling that it's just, it happens. And that's a real shame. And like I said, that just overall cringy and embarrassing. And I do wonder after coming out of this, like I think I said this before, the best part of Rings of Power is the music. The music's actually very good, for very obvious reasons. Why is the sound mix weird? I played with every setting on my television to watch this. And a few people have said this to me, even on Amazon Prime, the sound mix is weird. And it kind of shows. I went through every speaker from stereo to surround to every function, all 120 options. And the sound mix is strange. Voices drowned each other out. Special effects seem lower than the talking. There's obviously a lot of ADR going on here. And why is there a CGI filter over Galadriel's face a lot of the time? I don't get what they're trying to do with this series, and episode 3 just feels more disconnected and disjointed than the first 2 episodes. They're trying to tell a story that doesn't exist, and they've just made this debacle. Overall, 1.5 out of 5 stars. Overall, a mess. Overall, disjointed and ugly. Overall, terrible. And I'm going to put this one into the mix as well. Stop weaponizing criticism, Amazon. It's not a good look. Oh, episode 4 of The Rings of Power is here, and Elrond has daddy issues. And I don't quite know what this episode was meant to do. The problem is, nothing happens. There's no connection to these characters. There's no connection to anything here, and they feel like cardboard cutouts. I'm trying to keep this as spoiler-free as possible, because I get in trouble for that. But I watched this episode, and all I was thinking is, when does the plot start? There's lots of interconnected scenes, but they don't do anything. It's frustratingly slow, and I mean that. It's frustratingly slow. There's no half-foots in this one. And the whole relationship here between the princesses is just strange, and I won't go into too many details. But watching it, I realised fundamentally they're borrowing very heavily from Game of Thrones. This feels like a really bad Game of Thrones fan fiction in terms of how they're trying to get these character relationships going. And Game of Thrones had its slow moments, don't get me wrong, but it never felt like it was working at a snail's pace. It feels like it's fallen into the trap of trying to explain everything, which basically we've heard and know. This show doesn't need to exist. I don't know what the point of this series is at this point. There are also scenes and plot points and character relationships that remind me of Avatar: The Last Airbender, and that should be a whole genre of its own fiction currently. And I don't know how to explain that one completely, because it's so stunted. The character development, the plot, everything is stunted. And they fundamentally changed Numenor that it bears little to no resemblance to the source material that's presented in what they have the rights to. So I don't know why that's done. And yes, Elrond's daddy issues are hilarious. But what was the point to this episode? This episode was content again. I tried to sit down and I had to stop as I was watching, and there were some moments where I just burst out laughing. I feel like it didn't need to exist. That's how I would describe this episode. It was completely superfluous. It didn't need to exist. All of these few plot points, it just didn't it didn't do anything. And the problem is, and will say this, Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's Middle-earth works are so influential that the problem with this, instead of they're trying to make something original, air quotes, out of a story that's so influential that no matter how they did it, I don't think it would work. They're trying to shoehorn a socio-political fantasy into a high fantasy work, which is not the point of Lord of the Rings. And watching The Wheel of Time, which I was never a great lover of the books, but even I could see there were problems. Like, I'd read the books through, and even I could see there were problems. So when I came into this, I was kind of worried. Also the fact that they're trying to emulate those slower moments from the Rings trilogy. They're trying to emulate the Peter Jackson feel. And the problem with that is, it just doesn't work in this context. Galadriel is as unlikable and as Mary Sue-ish and as toxic as ever. I mean, it's almost laughable at this point. And when I tried to write this review, by the way, I had the best part of several hours, and I just thought this would be a 10-minute long scream. So I'm just recording this as it pops into my head, so I apologise. I don't really see where they can go from this. It doesn't connect to anything. It doesn't feel connected to actually even the rest of the series. It largely retreads the plots that are already there, and it retreads the relationships that are already there. And it just feels like I'm watching a cliched fantasy series. It feels like I'm watching a cliche rather than a benchmark of fantasy. This episode was cliche. That's the best word for it. It didn't try to do anything, and it is complete content filler episode. If they want to do filler episodes, why not do a monster of the week? Why not do a character? Why not do something? But instead we got this, and it's a shame. It's a real shame that we ended up with this debacle. I could rant about its disconnect from the source material and contradicting now the source material, because there are people regarding this as canon to the books and the Peter Jackson movies, which doesn't make sense because it contradicts what's already laid out in the Peter Jackson movies and the books. And as someone that loves the Silmarillion, seeing this kind of debacle, that's the only, I'm trying to not swear in this one, debacle, what the hell was it? What the hell was this episode? What the hell was the point to this episode? Superfluous, generic content filler that did absolutely nothing. And we're already midway in at this point to apparently the most expensive television show ever made. This is genuinely bad series, and it seems to be getting worse. And I don't know how to explain that. Also, again, laughable combat. Galadriel saves the day. Again. Come on. This has got to be a parody at this point, right? Like, I couldn't get my mind off of how generic it all felt and how dull. And just, if you're going to do the Atlantis mythos, do it the way Tolkien wrote it. Don't try and put your own story here. I mean, there is a lot of second-hand embarrassment and cringe going on, and this episode is prime example of that. Rings of Power episode 5 is here. I watched it so you didn't have to. Where are we going with this series? So, this is the We Are Going to War episode, and lots of training montages. There's no characterization going on, and there's no real movement of these characters. We're nearly at the end of this series. There's 3 episodes to go, and already, again, the pacing is weird. The pacing is improved in this episode, I will give it credit where credit's due, but watching the kind of lack thereof story unfold is bizarre. The foreshadowing of this series is bizarre as well, and I'm using the word bizarre because it's the only way I can describe it. Elrond is struggling to stay true to his oath. The Southlanders brace for a war. The problem is, it never feels like it does anything. The Half-Foots are surplus to background noise, which isn't good, and they're, again, trying to replicate the Peter Jackson films badly, which doesn't help matters. So, where does this episode fall down, and why does it fall down? First, again, characterization. These characters are not particularly fleshed out. Galadriel is strutting around with a sword and being angry. Elrond has become completely neutered. And the only good characters in it, which ironically are the dwarves, I mean, despite the problems here, they're probably the best characters in the entire show, really should have their own story. Do something original with them. I think that would have been cool. Like the Dwarven Princess. I don't like her as an actress, but actually in this she's shining. She's still not Tolkien, but she's shining. And that's a genuinely good thing. The foreshadowing is clumsy. Visions of the waves destroying the city. And also the allegories are in full. There was an allegory in the previous episode with the elves taking our jobs, with the one elf there and completely misrepresenting it, but also the fact that now the orcs are basically the air quotes colonizer, I hate that word, trope, and it just doesn't flow, it doesn't fit together. And the stunted storytelling in this is here. It's not subtle. It doesn't create subtlety. It creates a weird vacuum where everything is like the dream sequence in Twilight. Oh my god, Edward with fangs and a dark wolf and Jacob running around. It's like, oh, what are they? It doesn't flow and it doesn't fit together because it's so blunt. In terms of cinematography and all of that, this is again a mixed bag. The cinematography of this series is always bizarre, and the CGI is always bizarre as well. I said this in one video, when it looks good, it looks really good. When it looks bad, oh my god, it looks terrible. There is no middle ground, and I don't know what it is about this series that makes it look like there's about 20 different people all working with all working separately and no emails going back and forth. The design is disjointed at best, and that is ultimately a problem. I also find, again, the overall cheapness of this series shines through. Some of the props and some of the armour literally looks like it was 3D printed on someone first using a 3D printer. I also feel like I'm not watching Lord of the Rings in any way, or Tolkien's work. I feel like I'm watching a D&D CW show, and I got a lot of hate for saying that. But some of the effects look very CW. Some of the CGI looks so artificial and bizarre. It ends up just missing the mark and takes you out of what little there is to this series. This episode felt shallow, and it felt like there was no real urgency to it, just foreshadowing. And that, again, they're trying to keep this pace up, that this show is slow burn. And I don't mean that in a good way, the pacing is all over the place. But I do wonder how they're going to do it, because fundamentally, this series changes the history of Middle-earth. There are certain events and characters that can't happen in the story, because this is the characterization, the story, everything written in the appendices, and the Silmarillion, and the Lord of the Rings, and the Hobbit. There's a lot of stuff now that can't happen, and there's also a grandfather paradox that's building. Also, why is Elrond gay? Is this just me picking up on that, or is this an actual thing? Because that answers questions. I mean, ultimately, without any motivation for the characters, it just feels disjointed. And I feel like they're writing themselves into the hole that I will admit Tolkien wrote himself into. He wrote himself into a hole with the eagle situation and didn't know how to get out of it. So we have talking eagles, which has always been the weirdest moment in Lord of the Rings. I don't know how they're going to fix this because it's so disjointed from any canon material that even this episode feels like a D&D session rather than actually telling a Middle-earth or the Realms of Middle-earth story. I wonder how they'll do it, and I wonder where they're going to go with it, because, again, certain events and characters can't happen, and the fact that they don't have the rights to certain events and characters also shows, so they made up characters to fill the void. I wonder how they will deal with it, because it just doesn't fit. There's no chronological connection. And I see a lot of people debating if this series is canon, and it's very much not, because it's already contradicting events that happen in the future. And this episode is a prime example of that. Was it better than the previous one? Yes. But that's not much to say. At the end of the day, a weak show that isn't going anywhere, that is stunted. And it's stunted by the people that made it. It's stunted by the showrunners. It's stunted by Bad Robot. It's actually got some good actors in it, but they're stunted by the writing. There is moments of pure embarrassment, and I don't know if this is meant to be a parody or not. Episode 6 of The Rings of Power is here, and to quote Forbes, not even a battle can save this dumpster fire. This show, and I say this in all honesty, is the weirdest pacing I've ever seen, and some of the genuinely worst writing I've ever witnessed in a television series. The problem with this is that in this episode, everything gets big. There's more action in this episode. There are battles, there's erupting volcanoes, there's cavalry on doing their thing. And despite all of this, it remains unbelievably bad. And for some reason, this show is it's not a good adaptation of Tolkien. Fine. I think that's pretty much the running narrative now. But it's also just not a good generic fantasy show. And this episode shows even more. There's none of the half-foots or anyone. This show focuses mainly on the storyline of Galadriel and Númenor and Barwin, and it all kind of comes together. But that's it. Okay, so I will give some credit here. There is actually some good characterization in every character that isn't Galadriel. But then again, the writing is so bad that it doesn't really say much. In fairness, a cat saying hello would be better characterization than Galadriel and most of the writing in the show. What I find bizarre about this is this episode, everyone seems to be overacting. Everyone's kind of really being epic with bad writing and just cringy. And that's the only way I can describe it. I think I mentioned that at this point I'm so on the side of the orcs. Just slaughter everyone. Just kill them. It would be a better show. And I think I said this one before. If they wanted to make a good Second Age story, they should have just done a Númenor series, because they very much obviously wanted a Game of Thrones style show. And this episode feels more like Game of Thrones than any of the previous episodes. This show also seems to lack any concept of time and travel, and that's a very bizarre disconnect. It cuts to and from, and it's very obvious some of these scenes have been shot the same time as others because they're wearing the same costumes on the same sets. And then they're intercut with newer footage, and then there's also... How can I word this? People just teleport in this show. All of a sudden, Middle-earth has teleportation. I'm half expecting the USS Enterprise to show up. There's no sense of any drama. There's no sense of build-up. There's no payoff. And, you look at the settings, how it's done, you look at the characters, you look at what they're doing. And I mean, even the orcs in this are, I mean, literally the whole thing, it's just strange. And that's the only words I've got for it. So, Galadriel saves everyone as possible. And this is something else that I find strange. I mean, there's thousands of Numenorean ships, 300 men, 300 horses. They're going across the ocean from Numenor to Middle-earth. Somehow they make a 2,000-mile trip that fast. Literally, it just happens. They just get there. I mean, that 2,000 miles by boat, even with magic, that's a long journey. It's like when you go into a video game and you're playing The Witcher or Watch Dogs Legion or Assassin's Creed or something, and you hit the fast travel option. Because it's like, I can't be bothered to walk all this way. Or ride a horse. They just kind of show up, and that's it. They show up. And none of the good guys of any importance are killed or wounded or any way. And it also doesn't make sense, because Belwyn, who is at death's door just literally a few scenes earlier, seems to be totally fine and healed and happy and wonderful and just... What? I don't get this. I really don't get this. Galadriel barely fights. She just kind of dodges everything. She looks ridiculous in that armour. And the armour and everything looks so cheap in this. That's something else that I find so strange. The costumes in this show are really hit and miss. There's actually some really nice pieces. There are. And I'll give it credit where credit's due. But there are sometimes where you're looking, oh, the chainmail is printed on the fabric, and I can buy this fabric in my local fabric store to make kids' Halloween costumes. The battles do look good. But when you see some of the wide shots of this, the copy and pasting is very obvious, which is fine. All TV copy and paste extras is the fine thing. The whole thing, the army looks really small in some scenes and then really big in others. There's also inconsistencies of heights of the actors, the dwarves. There's the continuity. This show doesn't know its own continuity, and the show can't math. I don't know how they've messed this up to a point. It's so bad. And that's the only way I can talk about it. The defenders of this show are still going. There was one comment I read where they were like, I read Tolkien since I was a child in the 90s, and I think your coverage of this series is a disgrace. It just doesn't work. And I see a lot of people like, you need to sit back and just enjoy the show for what it is. The problem with that theory is that Tolkien sets the benchmark for fantasy. He's the granddaddy of fantasy in terms of modern literature. And him and Robert E. Howard, and I said that before as well. But the problem with that is it doesn't fit. This show doesn't work on many levels. And yeah, I'm kind of tired of beating the dead horse of Tolkien adaptation. But as a generic fantasy show, this doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And that's the problem. And the ratings are showing that. The ratings are not anywhere near as much as people have said, and there's a whole list of other things that have happened and gone wrong. I don't know if season 2 will happen. I know they're scouting for locations in the UK, but season 2 is heavily delayed. And I get the feeling they're going to do a lot of filming. If they do make season 2, a lot of it's going to be filmed in Wales, because Wales and New Zealand look very similar. Maybe parts of Scotland, but Wales is cheaper, and there's a tax rebate, but that's a whole different discussion. As a show, this is a mess. This is a complete mess. And now with mainstream media kind of saying the same thing, it's funny how the tides have turned, but then again, I think a lot of mainstream media doesn't want to be on the last rat on the sinking ship, so to speak. They're not going down with the ship. This show is embarrassing and insulting. It treats its audience like a bunch of idiots. The storytelling is crass. The set design is strange. The costumes are awful, mostly. And there's just an overwhelming sense of cheapness to the overall production. Yes, the cinematography can be quite pretty, but in terms of just design, some of this stuff looks like styrofoam. And everything looks paper thin, and it's really strange. Overall, just a weak television show, and this episode seems to be sinking the ship even faster. It's a shame as well, because I think this could have been something amazing if it had done right. Yes, I'm still watching this car crash. Yes, be thankful these videos are not me screaming for 10 minutes. Why, God, why? Episode 7 of The Rings of Power is here, and feelings are very mixed. General consensus of this episode is that it's a mess, and I firmly agree with that statement. Let's get into it. Basic summary of this episode. This finally moves some things forward, and it's bringing some story aspects together, be it clumsily. The eye is obviously a reference to the Eye of Sauron, and there are not so many subtle references to eyes throughout this entire episode, including a character that goes blind, that has no signs of injury or anything, even though she was blinded by a fire. That's a weird move. Galadriel and Halbrand reunite and head to the northwest. Okay. But again, her clear state of shock acting is not really acting. She surveys everything, but she's still cold, unlikable, with no real personality. And Halbrand does nothing else in this. The Númenóreans are portrayed as cowards. They head home, and they don't really do anything. This giant, big, epic navy that seems to come out of nowhere on all of those small ships, they're just portrayed as cowardly. They run. The Southlands are a complete mess at this point. They've been completely brutalised. Oh yes, and the Balrog awakes, and very obviously emulating the Peter Jackson films in terms of its look. And the Half-Foots basically do nothing, and not Gandalf and the whole thing. This is the thing about this series. It's lots of scenes that are just happen. There's no build-up and no connection. The orcs are set up in Mordor for the first time, but again, what the hell? Also, who designed some of this armour? When we just talk about the more C.S. Lewis-esque style of this entire piece, this is meant to bring season 1 to an end. We have one more episode. It's set up a basic premise that there's going to be either an all-out war or some epic cliffhanger, and I have a feeling they're going to end on a cliffhanger. There is no consequence, there's no build-up, there's no structure to this episode. It's just lots of scenes that don't really interconnect, and obviously a lot of scenes were filmed out of sync, just going by the costumes and the sets. Continuity does not exist in this universe for some reason, and it shows. Galadriel as an actress, the actress they've got playing her is just unlikable, and I feel like portraying her as this warrior Mary Sue type personality does not work at all, and I've said that before. What I don't understand about this episode, and this is something that's kind of bugging me now, is that this show suffers from pacing and story structure issues, and this episode is a prime example of it. It sets up things, it sets up moments, but there is no payoff. There is no build-up to these moments either. It's just stuff happens. The editing is extremely poor. Also, the lack of, considering, again, the money and people involved in this show, at least remembering your own continuity would be a good idea. This series fundamentally changes the history of Middle-earth, and it really shows. Now we need to get to the other stuff in this video. So, between the showrunners calling fans evil, they obviously don't like Tolkien, and it shows, and they're now blaming the Tolkien estate for their own failure. We have so many issues now that the breakdown of this episode is almost difficult to handle, and the biggest thing that's really happened here is Galadriel's husband is dead. So at this point, Galadriel is meant to be ancient. Why is she being portrayed more like her early First Age and pre-First Age self when this show isn't dealing with that very well? With her husband dead, her agency is kind of gone, and they're probably going to bring him back with some MacGuffin at some point, but ultimately that's also a problem. Also, the will they, won't they thing with not Sauron is kind of odd, and also the kind of weird chemistry between her and Elrond, her future son-in-law, is also uncomfortable. I don't get what they're trying to do. Also, where is her daughter? That's one question I still have. I've watched this episode through. I've gone back to parts. Where is her daughter? Because she's quite important in this whole big thing. Also, they've swapped around a lot of Galadriel's story with Elrond's in this version of her, which also really does come to show in this. I also don't understand the motivations of these characters because they don't seem to exist, other than her wanting to prove everyone wrong and just some very unlikable characterization. The writing is atrocious. This whole series feels like a disjointed fan film made with someone's handycam or their phone. And I'm going to beat this dead horse again, but the special effects are extremely hit and miss. There is some gorgeous scenery in this, but for every gorgeous piece of scenery, there is some very atrocious stuff happening, and it's very obvious in some scenes. In some of the battle scenes in previous episodes, weapons magically appear in people's hands and then disappear in the next scene, or just appear mid-shot. This show is boring, paceless, doesn't know what it's meant to be doing, and I feel like it's slowly burning its bridges. Now with season 2 confirmed, but somewhat delayed, so we probably won't see season 2 until 2024 at this point, or the very latest, the end of 23. I don't know how they're going to do this. This series fundamentally messes the history of Middle-earth up to a point of the Lord of the Rings can't happen at this point, which is another big screaming problem. Even if this show was not a Tolkien show and it was just a generic fantasy TV show, I would be saying exactly the same thing. This show is badly written, and this episode, why I think is better than the others, is still badly written, and the lines and dialogue are so clumsy in places. It's trying way too hard to be something far deeper than it is, and loses sight of what it's meant to be, and knowing that the creators of this show just hate you and call you evil, because, oh my god, how dare you criticize our writing? How dare you criticize our story structure and editing? You know, they play certain cards and it's straight out of the Disney playbook. I don't know how they're going to write themselves out of this unless some magical MacGuffins bring some people back to life, set the story, or Galadriel wakes up and it was all a dream. Seriously, at this point, I wonder how they're going to do this, because it's like watching a car crash in slow motion. The Rings of Power has limped to the finish line, and from the get-go, The Rings of Power has not been a good series, a show that's been unable to find its story, unable to find its plot, and very obvious from the get-go with all of the leaks, and yes, I'm saying the get-go just to annoy that one commenter, obvious that Halbrand is Sauron. And by the way, Halbrand is a completely original character made up for this series. Sauron of this area was in an elven form, but that's a whole different discussion. So, they arrive, Galadriel and Halbrand, the big revelation happens, there's some info dumping by the elves, some clumsy writing that intends to be deep, and then an epic battle. Kind of. This show, this season finally has a plot. That's like the big thing that actually shocked me. It actually has a plot, where before it's never had a plot. It's never had really much going on. It's just lots of scenes just happening with no build-up or anything. The editing is still terrible, the characterization is terrible, the writing is still bad, and the quality of this series is not only abundantly, laughably bad, but its defenders on the internet are also abundant and laughably bad. I see a lot of people chiming in and saying, well, it needs to get to season 3 before it's good. No, a series should be good from the get-go and should pull you in. This show, ultimately, and its final is not exempt from this, but it's just a mess. Lots of stuff just happens, lots of info dumping, lots of just plot beats with no payoff or build-up, no characters, nothing really builds, and you go into this episode with the big revelation of who Halbrand is, air quotes, big revelation, to the battle and all of this stuff, and it very much is ripping off the Fellowship at this point. It's tried to emulate the Fellowship without the care, attention, and good writing and editing, and it's failed miserably. This is ultimately a failure of a season final. I don't know where they're going to go from season 2, because I think they're going to need to do a major retooling for this entire show if they're going to keep going on. The show represents a failure not only in terms of writing, structure, story, acting, but it also represents a failure of adaptation. They obviously don't know what adaptation means, and this is a prime example of it. An adaptation of work is taking a work and adapting it for screen or television. Game of Thrones, the original Lord of the Rings trilogy, The House of the Dragon. This, on the other side, doesn't represent any adapted work. There's very little Tolkien in this. And I know that's a nitpick, and I know people are like, well, you're a purist, well, no. The thing is, if you want to adapt Tolkien's work, adapt Tolkien's work. This is a 99% original story with original characters. The writing is completely detrite within this entire series, and the season final didn't really do anything. It didn't change anything. It didn't feel epic, it didn't feel big, it's static and it's clumsy. And ultimately, it felt like I was watching a very bad fan-made film. It didn't feel any connection to its source material or the previous episodes. That's another thing. This show seems to rewrite itself every episode, and the connection between the episodes is loose at best. It's very obvious that they don't quite know what they're doing, but that's what happens when you get a bunch of no-name talentless hacks to create something based on a well-loved IP. This show feels it's disjointed. The structure of this episode, the final episode, is disjointed. The way the story happens and unfolds is disjointed. And at this point, you would expect they would at least try and tidy up the editing. The special effects are obviously inconsistent because they are inconsistent. And when you get these beautiful vistas and beautiful scenery, but then it cuts to close-ups and it's like 5 people on a donkey on a set that it looks tiny and made out of styrofoam, there is a problem here. This show ultimately represents failure, and the season 1 finale, which should be this epic big thing, just felt weak. The characters, the plot, everything just happens with no real payoff, no real moments, and just that dun dun dun, Halbrand is Sauron. Ultimately, what were they thinking and how were they creating this? Structure is very important, and if something is not structured well, it shows, and this whole series is a prime example of that. But I think in terms of structure, this episode was structured badly. The irony is, you didn't need the whole season to get to this point. This could have been an hour-long episode into itself of a standalone thing. Its disconnect from the rest of the show and how it feels compared to the rest of the show is interesting. But it never needed this, doesn't need to be a big thing. The whole series genuinely is quite embarrassing to watch, and there was a lot of secondhand laughter when I was watching this. The show is just clunky, and the whole thing with the stranger and the hobbit, it's just a mess. And the Lord of the Tides as an episode really is weak, and it feels cobbled together. That's the word for it. It feels cobbled together rather than actually thought out and planned. It doesn't feel like they really knew how to get here. This show didn't even need the season to get here. You could have info dumped the whole entirety of the first 7 episodes and then just had this as a standalone, which is not a good sign for any television show. Season 2, they're now scouting locations, but the delays of Season 2 are very much apparent. And watching the defenders of this show online say, well, you've never read Tolkien. Tolkien's work is slow. Yes, it is. But it's well thought out and well paced. The Peter Jackson movie is a prime example of that, and it's very unfair to compare them, because the Peter Jackson movies are gold dust, where this is a pound of lead. Ultimately, I wonder how they're going to cope with season 2. And I get the feeling there's going to be either major retooling or major changes, because, you know, this whole show is a mess. And watching this season finale, which felt very much on its own in a sea of crap, is a bizarre experience. Revelations that didn't work, things that were obviously true from the get-go, and unlikable Mary Sue Guy Ladriel leading the cavalry, shouting at people, being angry, and trying to sound deep and interesting in costumes bought from Wish. It's a shame, because Tolkien, and I've said this before, but Tolkien's work should represent a benchmark in fantasy. It should be the benchmark. It shouldn't be a lackluster, lazy television show that feels more generic than anything. And just to clarify a point, because someone didn't quite understand this, I mentioned in a video that there's a very C.S. Lewis style visual to a lot of the costumes and armour. If you ever read the Chronicles of Narnia and look at some of the work associated with it, artwork and things, the whole visuals, the costumes, the armour, tends to have a bizarrely C.S. Lewis vibe to it. It's very much closer to that than anything Tolkien ever described. It's interesting to see. Ultimately, this season final is a failure, along with the rest of the series. It's ultimately just content for a streaming service. It's ultimately quite laughable at this point, and it's a real shame that it is. I really hope this show doesn't last any longer, because, you know, it's terrible. And as someone pointed out in my comments, well, the show will get cancelled, and then they will say, well, the audience wasn't ready for authentic Tolkien. No, the audience wants authentic Tolkien. They didn't. They want a Game of Thrones rip-off. And if they wanted to do a Game of Thrones rip-off, they should have just focused on the Numenor story and just done the fall of Numenor without the rings. And even then they would have messed it up at this point, I'm sure of it. But they could have at least got what they wanted. This show is laughable, it's embarrassing, it's bad, it's detritus. And this season final is a prime example of an overall terribly executed series that I had to physically stop myself from screaming. Anyway, tell me what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you guys later.